Well, hi there. Welcome to the show. I love to get together every Tuesday with Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Chance to kind of get my sanity back and commiserate about the passing scene. Eric, how are you today?
Well, I'm good, Brian. Have we got a deal yet? Is the deal on?
Oh, it has been a bit off and on, right?
Apparently so. And you probably caught the interview with the lady from Meet the Press, where red is apparently the new orange. I kind of thought I was being snarky and headlined my article about that, wherein I think Trump's shtick that worked very well for a long time of accusing the mainstream press of being fake news, which was valid
Oh,
because
yeah.
the mainstream media absolutely is biased, absolutely was out to get him, and all of that was true. But it wears thin when facts come onto the table, such as the fact that Trump serially promised to not start another war and was going to keep us out of these Middle East sand traps. And here he is doing it, right in our faces, and then denying it, having the audacity to deny that he ever said that he wasn't going to get us involved in these things. So
Yeah, I'm going to hold my tongue a little bit. That was some of the least presidential behavior I've
yeah,
seen, but I do agree with his premise that the mainstream press has been untrustworthy for a very long time. Scott Pelley's departure from 60 Minutes. Oh man, you talk about pitiful, blustery equivocation of, well, we had something very good here, and Barry Weiss is destroying it all, and he got called on his particular spin,
I
and he's
agree with
not
you
happy
100%.
about it.
But the thing that just makes me want to take a ball peen hammer and hit my head is that Trump is undoing everything. Everything. The well earned mistrust that the mainstream media, so called, has acquired over the last several decades is being vitiated by Trump's even more corrupt conduct, his even more egregious lying. He's making their case. I mean, that's what's happening. He's rebuilding the credibility of these leftists because he's such an obvious and egregious liar and hypocrite.
Speaking of obvious and egregious lies, let's talk about democracy.
Yeah.
I'm hearing that word a lot, and people say, well, what, are you against democracy? And my flat answer is yes, because
Yeah. And
it's
so are the
nothing more than
founders.
mob rule.
Again, historical amnesia. There's a reason why the government schools don't teach history and why kids aren't taught to learn about the past. That word democracy, back in the 18th century, when the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence were written, that word was almost a cuss word to say democracy, because those men who were very well educated, learned men who knew about ancient Greece and they knew about democratic societies that had existed in the past understood the danger of this idea of majority rule. And it's not just that it's a danger, it's also a fatuity. It's never examined. People superficially say, well, democracy is good because the majority have decided. And there's sort of this implicit moral sanction. If most people want something, then that's got to be good. But when you really look into it, it's not the majority that does anything, it's a minority that claims to represent and speak for this so called majority. Look at our presidential elections. Best case scenario, about half the people vote, right? Who are eligible. So about half of those people decide the outcome, which is a minority. And even that minority is smaller still, because who decides who gets to be the candidate of either party? An extremely small minority of people select and choose the person that's going to be put forward for you and I to go through the patty cake kabuki thing of, oh, we have a choice. Oh, we get to vote for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. That's our democracy in a nutshell.
The people have spoken, just like they did in Los Angeles, apparently, where as the votes continue to trickle in, I should put that in air quotes. The one candidate who actually was promising a different direction than business as usual. He's been edged out by what was it again? Oh, Democratic Socialist. Interesting.
Even if you, okay, democracy gave us Donald Trump, right? And the people who voted for Trump, I think it's safe to say the majority of people who voted for him voted because they did not want more wars. They wanted less government. They wanted better economic times. They didn't want higher energy costs. Well, what are we getting? We're getting exactly the opposite of what we voted for, aren't we? So much for democracy. Vote harder next time.
Eric, it sounds like you're not trusting the plan.
I'm not trusting the plan. And more to the point, I don't trust democracy for the same reason that Jefferson, Washington, Adams and all the rest of those old powdered wig guys from the 18th century didn't trust democracy. In fact, they were very careful to erect this system, the Constitution, that provided all sorts of mechanisms to thwart democracy that have been specifically and deliberately undermined for 150 years now. Piece by piece, they have been taking it all away with the idea ultimately of having this unlimited democracy. You hear the Democrats specifically want that. They want at the national level to have the presidency decided by a mass plebiscite.
Yep.
Majority wins. That's it. Winner take all. And down that road lies the same thing that Plato talked about in his book, The Republic, which I recommend reading to those listening who are not familiar with the work.
No, you're spot on here. Plato identified a couple thousand years ago that there's a digression that takes place when you go by majority rule, which is what democracy is. I'm going to use a little bit different word. Democracy, that whole idea of the majority 50% plus one is the voice of the people. No, that is collectivism because it's used to run roughshod over the rights of the individual. And what the founders gave us, per Ben Franklin, following the Constitutional Convention, was a rights-based republic with the caveat, if you can keep it, which we are not doing a very good job of approaching, the 250th birthday of the nation.
I mean, if you think about it, the idea of a right, if it's not inalienable, to use the word of the powdered wig guys, then it's not a right. If it's something that can be voted away, if it's something the majority can decide to alter at any time, you have no rights. What you have at very best are some conditional privileges that you might be allowed to exercise for a period of time. And that's a pretty shaky way to live.
It is, and I'm fixating on this whole thing, but it's because I just finished writing an article about a poll that was taken. I can't remember now the name of the polling. Not Elon Musk, but Elon, like a college poll about asking people, their attitudes as we approach, America's 250th anniversary, and the thing that they came up with is, well, people are they're uneasy as we approach this milestone, not sure what exactly to feel. I think it was 55% of Democrats said, well, actually, I'd rather live abroad in another country. Now, Republicans, that number was pretty low at like 10%. Independents, however, and I have to believe there's probably a growing body of independents based on, the Trump's behavior here over the last few months. They were about 36%. So it just gets you wondering. And one of the things that they talked about was, well, is democracy still important? Is it something that is being realized? And I think what a foolish question, or what a misleading question to presume that was the end goal that the founders wanted. I think you pointed out earlier, they never mentioned that in the Declaration or the Constitution. Democracy
Absolutely.
is not mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think the reason for the uneasiness is that democratic societies, so-called, are inherently unstable and inherently authoritarian. Everything's in flux. You never know what's going to happen because everything is subject to these elections during which the whim of the mob, controlled by a minority, can alter everything. I mean, from the individual level all the way up to people who run businesses. How do you make decisions for the future when you really have no sound basis for knowing what that future is going to be? If you have a right and it's respected, then my rights will be respected, or at least you have a reasonable belief in that. Whereas if you know that whatever you think to be your conditional privileges today can be revoked next week, you're in a state of paralysis, aren't you? Paralysis and chaos. And that's what happens to democratic societies.
I really strongly recommend our listeners check out your article, Democracy is a Silly Lie, which you published just a couple of days ago. It's something we need to understand before we go to the polls. And I know that a lot of people are sick of politics already and the electioneering and so forth. But if you want to really go there and cast your vote, if you choose to vote, at least understand what the word means versus what you're being told it means.
And why are so many things even up for a vote? I mean, just look at it on a purely practical level. Underlying it is this idea that other people somehow know better than you do how your own affairs ought to be organized. We are not talking about, generally speaking, things having to do with people getting hurt, life and death, stuff like that. We're talking about how you're going to run your business. We're talking about what kind of car you're going to drive or be allowed to drive, how many miles per gallon. All these penny ante, ridiculous, pedantic, endless micromanaging things. It's become insufferable. It's like we all live in a gigantic kindergarten now, and we get to vote for whoever the kindergarten cops are.
Yeah, it's insulting to the intelligence of people who actually care about their freedom. Now, for people who want to be taken care of and be more sheep-like in how they live their lives, oh, it's a dream come true. You don't
I
have to take
suppose I still think it's
responsibility.
a nightmare though, because you're not even well taken care of. Look at what happens inevitably when these systems are imposed. You end up with something like China, the Soviet Union, where the majority, the masses, live this diminished, impoverished, desperate lifestyle, which consists of wearing drab clothes, standing in line, hoping you're going to get a slice of stale bread, and doing what you're told is some dreary mindless job all day, and that's how you spend your life. No wonder the average Russian drank a fifth of vodka every day, wouldn't you?
Well, and you can see it in the architecture of the buildings in their society. There's nothing that's beautiful. Everything is utilitarian because you are considered utilitarian. You're just a commodity that the state or someone who knows better is there to order around and direct.
Yep,
You don't
that's
get to
an
call your own
interesting point
shots.
that you make, because it's an attack on creativity, and creativity is fundamentally an individual thing. It's the inspiration of a particular person who has a spark and thinks about doing something not just differently but their way. And that's how beautiful things arise. The suppression of beauty is the suppression of creativity, which leads to this dreary, bleak, ugly sameness, which is why you see in these countries that are authoritarian and democratic, go
Yep.
back a little bit in time and remember the old Soviet Union. You had the Soviet satellites like East Germany, which in Germany, it was the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, DDR, democratic. And if the
Hmm.
Soviet Constitution was full of democracy, Democrats, you hear this language everywhere in the most authoritarian kinds of societies. And it's just it's sort of an evil Jedi mind trick on people, because again, they think like at a really superficial level, oh, well, isn't it good, if we're in a room with, 10 people and most of us decide we're going to go see movie X or go to restaurant, whatever it is, that's a good thing. That's fair. What we should do things that way. Except,
Yeah.
of course, that's by agreement. Like, if you're sitting around with your family and you're talking about, hey, are we going to go to Applebee's or are we going to go to Chipotle? And, there's a discussion back and forth and you guys all agree, okay, well, we're going to go to Applebee's tonight. That's fine. Nobody's shoving a bayonet in anybody's back. And if you really don't want to go, you could probably say, you know what, I think I'm going to stay home. That's not evil. It becomes evil when you start to inject the coercion into it, which always is the case in these democratic societies. There's always that bayonet that's behind the ballot box.
I love that you used the example of, like finding a place we can agree on to eat. Because people will say, Eric, Brian, you guys are just you're being way too rigid. You're absolutists in how you're approaching this. There has to be compromise for anything meaningful to take place. Okay, but compromise has to be limited to things where compromise is possible. Where we're going to eat dinner, that's a place where compromise is possible. But there are some things you cannot compromise on and still have what you started out with. Those inalienable rights, that's one of those places. You can't compromise a little and say, well, you can have free speech, but only to this point where it's criticizing Israel or whatever the case may be. Nope. It's all or nothing. You either have it or you don't.
Compromise is amicable when it is not coercive. For example, a couple gets married. Where are we going to live? What kind of house are we going to have? And the couple, they discuss it and they decide what they want to do. How many kids are we going to have? All these decisions that are arrived at by mutual free consent. And contrary-wise, if you get into a situation where compromise becomes untenable, the way to diffuse that is to agree to do your separate things, whether in marriage, in friendship, in business, whatever. If you just get to a point where you can't come to a reasonable compromise understanding that makes both people content, both people happy, then you just diffuse it by saying, okay, well, you go ahead and do your thing. I'm going to do my thing. No problem at that point. The problem is only when you bring coercion into that equation.
And sadly, that's what a lot of politics has become. It's not about we got to make sure the government is operating to ensure that justice prevails and that our rights are being protected. It's kind of morphed into this. They don't think like we do, and as soon as we get to power, it is our duty to punish them. And I mean, both sides really kind of treat it that way. That's
Sure.
a little bit scary because as we're going to find out, Trump will not be president forever. So all the people who are cheering, as he's, putting it to the libtards, they're going to be on the receiving end of that very same thing from President Newsom or something worse.
Yeah, and democracy again. These arbitrary diktats that Trump has been issuing, these executive orders, which are antithetical to the whole concept, of democracy. It's one man autocratically decreeing something is going to be a certain way. Well, those are precedents that are being set, and when he's gone, and there is a leftist authoritarian who wields that power, do you think that they're not going to do the same thing? Plus, even worse, even more? Of course
Oh
they
yeah.
are. And that's
While
why
at the
it's so
same
short
time,
sighted and so reckless, because Trump is not looking beyond his own lifetime, his own tenure, which again is probably the most unstatesmanlike thing imaginable. He has a debt, an obligation to futurity, as Jefferson might have said, to do his best to see to it that after he's gone, both literally and as president, that things don't get worse on account of what he does right now.
yeah, it's setting the stage for some epic snapback. And we've been seeing this, I think, pretty clearly in the last few election cycles. When the Republicans take power, and I mean, Trump was a good example of this. And yeah, I kind of felt a little thrill when Doge was
Sure.
trotted out, and oh man, we're finally going to be righting some wrongs. Which, of course, those on the other side of the equation were like, oh, he's tearing down our democracy and everything that's good. But think of how we were abused under the Biden administration, and just understand that it's that exponentially worse the next time the Democrats get their hands on power. And that's not, a full-throated, endorsement of the Republicans, because they're not doing such a great job of protecting what they're supposed to protect either.
No, the hypocrisy totally undermines their moral position as well. People were understandably outraged by the way the federal government weaponized dissent during Biden's tenure. Well, what does Trump do? He does things like goes after Jimmy Kimmel, and uses the threatening power of the federal government through the FCC to get people like him and Colbert removed. Well, I mean, so at that point, shut up, spare me your outrage. I don't like those guys particularly. I don't watch their show, but leave it up to the audience. If people want to watch them, let them watch them. That was our argument. Let us have the information. We'll decide what we want, what we like, not you, the federal government. Well, Trump has totally destroyed that argument from a moral point of view.
Now, I have to point this out, and I think you'll back me up on this. For those who do celebrate Independence Day, in reality, what we are celebrating is something known as secession,
Yep.
which a few people's heads explode just at the mention of that word. Their inner General Grant wants to struggle to the surface,
Isn't that
but
interesting? For much of my lifetime, the 4th of July has been just that, the 4th of July. You don't hear much of Independence Day any longer. I think because if you start to use that word, it kind of edges a little bit too close to the word that you just used, which is secession. And this to me is just a binary, obvious thing. The 13 colonies sought to separate themselves, to secede from the British Empire. The colonies were part of the British Empire. That's what the Confederacy tried to do. They didn't want to be part of the American Empire, the United States, which at one time was considered a plurality.
yep,
Each of the 13 colonies were treated as sovereign states by the British government during the peace treaty negotiations. They were sovereign states. It was understood. It was a given. So, it was kind of surprising probably to the leadership of the secession movement in 1860, 1861 that the federal government, that the North would say, you can't leave. You're with us for life. There is no out, because their fathers and grandfathers would have said, what are you talking about? Of course they can leave. This is a voluntary compact. This is,
yep.
this is something that we've entered into for limited purposes. We delegate certain powers to this federal government, particularly to deal with foreign governments and so on. But that's it. We retain the sovereignty because the people ultimately are sovereign. Well, that was done away with during the late unpleasantness, as it is often called down here in the South. And now it's been 150 something years, and people have been conditioned to look at that as some sort of an insurrection. And the use of that term, the Civil War. It wasn't a civil war. I mean,
Yep.
ask any historian who's worthy of his sheepskin. A civil war means you have two factions within a country that are vying for control of the country, of the totality. The English had a civil war. We had a war of secession. It's a very different thing.
And I'm going to springboard from that into as people, those who understand and celebrate the secession that took place, as America gained its independence. I want to suggest that secession also takes place. In fact, the most important place that it happens is at the individual level. So people who choose to homeschool their kids because they don't want their kids being indoctrinated into whatever the latest woke nonsense is that's filtering into the classroom, that's a form of secession. Turning off what Hollywood is offering and saying, nah, I have better things to do. That's a form of secession. It's basically, if bad ideas rule the world, it doesn't mean they have to rule your world. And wherever possible, people should consider basically separating themselves from the people or individuals that are trying to control them, that are not agreeable with how you wish to live your life.
Isn't it interesting that so many people can't see that and can't make the connection, and yet in their daily lives they practice secession all the time? Consider the example of you meet somebody and you get to be friends with this person, but something happens in the course of your friendship with this person that causes you to no longer wish to be friends with them. Perhaps they've done something unethical and shady that you don't like. So you simply secede from the friendship. I'm not interested in associating with this person anymore for reasons that I have. And I don't need to justify the reasons. They're my reasons, and that makes them valid reasons. Enough. Everybody does that. You choose not to do business in a certain store because you don't like the way they do their business. All of these things. We just take this stuff as completely normal and moral. And yet somehow when you scale it up a little bit, it becomes like the worst thing imaginable. You rebel, you insurrectionist.
Right? I have to control you or else you're wrong.
Well, I use this graphic when I write about this that has a picture of Abraham Lincoln, and it says, "If you leave me, I'll kill you."
That's a truth that not a lot of people are ready to consider, but it is a truth
Yep.
nonetheless. By the way,
Yep.
that survey I was referencing, they I think they asked 1,000 adults 18 and older in the U.S. Who is the greatest president? Abraham Lincoln.
Isn't
Number
that
one
astonishing?
answer. Yeah.
Well, by the way, in another little historical footnote, if you look into it, Lincoln was not a popular president. In fact, he was hugely unpopular during the war. It was only after he was assassinated that there was this apotheosis, that he was elevated to sainthood by the Republicans, who controlled the country for the next 20 years and, erected all sorts of like almost like, you have to go literally back to ancient Rome where they would deify the Caesars, Divus Augustus, and they would erect temples and statues. Well, that's exactly what we do here in this country. These huge marble statues and busts, and the populace therefore no longer regards this individual as a man, just like any other man with his flaws and all of that. He's a god. You go to the Lincoln Memorial and gaze at the marble statue, Abe sitting in his chair like Jehovah. I mean, it's crazy when
With
you think about it.
with the fasces under
Yes,
each of his arms, the bundles
yes,
of sticks, representing
yes.
unity,
Yep.
enforced unity. Well, I think we've blown a few minds for today, and
Yeah.
this this is this is what you need to be thinking about, though, if you're going to be a person who really wants to be autonomous and think for yourself. And yeah, sometimes it's painful to bump up against. Better to endure that pain than the peace and comfort of being a mental slave to democracy
Yeah,
and all
if
that
you're
it
a
has to
parent, if you
offer.
have if you have school age kids, the very best thing you can do, and I think you'll probably agree with what I'm about to say, take them out of government schools, give them books, help them learn to think, and you'll have done them an immense favor. That's what parents used to do before we got into this whole government school thing. Kids were taught how to reason, how to think, and then everything sort of falls into place naturally. Once a person learns how to think, Ayn Rand talked about the conceptual faculty, by which she meant the ability to think, to grasp a principle, understand what a principle and abstraction is, and then use that to understand particular things and see how they relate to one another. That's the essence of what it means to be a thinking person. And that is precisely what the government schooling system does its very best to stamp out.
I'm gonna add one footnote too from Albert J. Nock, and that is what distinguishes an individual or a part of the remnant who are thinkers and who are self actuators from the masses who are largely mindless herd thinking is the ability to apprehend truth and incorporate it into their lives. And you got to be willing to think for yourself to do that. You can't just chant in unison with other people.
Absolutely.
Eric, great as always to visit with you. I feel invigorated Onward to another week. I look forward to talking
Likewise,
next
Cameron. Thank
Tuesday.
you as always.